Welcome to the Historical Detective Agency, your stop for journeying back in time to examine history as an investigator would.
Okay, it is May 19th, 2026, and we're going to do a quick topic today about a discussion that we had in kind of a closed private group, and it's about an educational system that Socrates actually said allows one to come into your own being, right? It allows a soul to come into his own being. And that educational system or that organizational structure has existed for about 2,000 years, from the Greeks to roughly about the 18th, 19th century within the West. And it formed the educational structure of the West, and it formed how the Western mind saw information, processed information, and was able to communicate that information going forward. The bedrock, if you will, about the paradigm that the West had and how we interacted with information and with each other. And so what we're going to talk about today is that system, and it's known as Septem Artis Liberalis, which basically means the seven liberal arts. But if you are in the West in modern times, liberal arts, depending on your circle, will have a negative connotation. And so the term has evolved or devolved, depending on your framework, from its original meaning, which was simply a free man. So the seven liberal arts meant the seven arts that were necessary for a free man to use to come into his own, as Plato would say, or later, as Hugh of St. Vincent would say, to understand man's relationship to understanding and communicating and conceptualizing his relationship with God. And that system is very important. There was also a good Substack article that I had seen that brought it back to the forefront of my memory. Unfortunately, I can't find it. So if you're the author of that Substack, please let me know so I can give you attribution for being able to remind me of this system, which actually is very good and has a good historical basis around it. So again, we're at the cabin in the northern woods right now, or the northern border. So it's still very Rockford Files budget, so very Rockford Files level. So, but again, if sometimes you can learn a lot more from a stick in the dirt than you can from a very fancy PowerPoint presentation. So we're going to go into what constitutes this system, and it's a building block, and it's divided up. There's seven, but they're divided into two main groups: the trivium and the quadrivium. And these were defined actually by Boethius, who was a Christian philosopher in Rome about the 5th century. He wrote between roughly about 480 to 524. And he really started to define these. But the subjects themselves had been differentiated by Plato. He attributed it to he had attributed it to Socrates, and continually underwent some refinements and definitions over the next 2,000 years in the West. But essentially, the framework remains the same. Within it, of course, you have grammar, logic, rhetoric. And then once you've mastered these, now you're ready to move on to arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, which is sometimes called cosmology, depending on what source you're reading. And then that evolved into incorporating a lot of physics. And then once you've established all of these, now you're ready to go on to specialization and particularization. So looking at this to start off with, and also people like, for example, Hugh of St. Vincent, who was a monk priest in France, he stated that these needed to be not only all included. So if you taught these out of order, you introduce confusion. But if you omit any of these in the process, that you have then negated any benefit that you would have earned by it. So the sequence is important, and including everything in it is also important. So we start off, of course, with grammar, and that is simply understanding and labeling and defining everything around you, including your thoughts. So the physical world, your mental world, creating definitions and understanding the structuring, being able to communicate those initial concepts of definitions. Once you've mastered that, now you're into logic, and that is to essentially argue your concept of reality and evaluate others' arguments, right? So we're working on comprehension and reasoning in this portion of it. So you're taking the definitions and forming them into concepts about reality and using reason and comprehension. Now, once you master that, you go down into rhetoric. And in that, we begin to move into complex ideas. And that's your extended arguments, and you're focused more on persuasiveness and consistency. And of course, you evaluate that the same in others. So focusing on being able to have a persuasive argument and a consistent argument in your logic. Now, once that's done, now you have the ability to communicate. You can understand, you can define, contextualize. Now you can communicate, or as, for example, the Hugh of St. Vincent or Hugh of St. Victor had stated, now you can kind of begin to understand the concept to know God and to contemplate God's language, which he saw as kind of math. And that's the quadrivium. And it starts off, much as grammar did for language, it starts off with arithmetic. You have to understand the fundamentals of numbers. And so this is quantifying and qualifying numbers. And once you've mastered that, now you move into geometry, which is essentially defined as numbers in space, is how they looked upon this. So now numbers in the physical world, you look at measurements, you look at comparing, you look at forming of shapes. Then you move down to music, which is numbers in time. Now, this was seen not just in that, but it evolved over time to include the ability to take two disparate elements and harmonize them together. So again, going back to Hugh of St. Victor, the monk priest in France, he saw that you had the ability to be able to take what he thought was opposites and synthesize them. And he looked at harmonics, both constructive and destructive. He looked at forming that. But no matter what, it was always still grounded to the use of math or the use of numbers in time. So it was still very much a structured element. You could look at synthesis, but it still had to have a fundamentally grounded basis. And finally, now there was astronomy or cosmology and physics, and that was numbers in both space and time. And again, looking at how you synthesize all of these together, the building blocks worked to be able to define it. Now you are seen as a complete human being or a complete free human being. You have the building blocks, you have the toolkit to now go out and to specialize. And in the early days, it was philosophy and theology. Later on, it became engineering and things of that nature. There were still specialized schools for agriculture, textile making, weaving, that sort of thing. So for certain very technical skills, they still had classes just in that skill development. However, for what they saw as leaders or for free men, their version of liberal arts included all of these in sequence with discipline to be able to go forward and do that. Again, it fell out of favor in roughly about the 18th, 19th, 20th century, depending on the geographic area where you were at. Some countries adopted it earlier, and it was a shift from what it was traditionally a religious-based university system to a secular-based university system that was more focused on commercialization. So it didn't need to build up a human being. It just needed to produce someone who could specialize in a certain revenue-producing task. And so it began to divorce itself from kind of that moral grounding, whether Socrates' definition, which was, you could come into your own soul, or whether it was the laters like Boethius or Hugh of St. Vincent that says you are coming into understanding and finding your relationship with God in a more meaningful way as a human being. That happened. So if you're interested in more, I'll put some links in the description below about some areas where you can go and learn each of the evolutions that the Septem Artis Liberalis took as it kind of evolved over the 2,000 years. But again, the framework was there as far back as Plato, who wrote about it. And he said this was the building block pretty much of the universe. And so looking forward, there are other modalities of learning that people promote. Some of them say math is first. Some of them say then you can go into language. Others say you can learn it in parallel. But there is a lot of evidence over 2,000 years that this is a very effective system also for grounding people in kind of a morality of what is a human being in interactions with technology, which becomes even more important today. So there are a lot of groups out there now wanting to reintroduce this system into a structured learning for children so that they can become a complete human being, a free human being. And then you can interact with technology and specialize because you have that grounding, understanding what are the outcomes and what's really the morality of it. And you can define your thoughts and you're less susceptible to influence because I can define it and resist and argue against it persuasively and consistently. So again, very good topic. Thank you very much for that. Pardon for the Rockford Files level, but we are remote on location doing other things. So I thought very interesting. So be safe out there and keep investigating.